Our topic this afternoon is South Africa, and we're going to show you a film clip of events there. Please take notes, and please take down names.
The African government seems to know what it's doing. It wanted to avoid massive and possibly violent demonstrations today on this 10th anniversary of the Soweto uprising. It did. It wanted to limit what journalists and critics of its policies inside South Africa might have to say to the outside world. It has. But it has achieved all of this at the cost of bringing South Africa to the very brink of martial law. And the very toughness of the measures now being imposed is likely to extract its own price. Clearly, the South African government believes that if it is tough enough, it can keep a bad situation from getting worse. Ironically, as Nightline correspondent Jeff Greenfield reports, that is precisely what the government assumed 10 years ago today.
It was quite a momentous event. I mean, one woke up that morning with a great deal of anticipation. It would have been their first taste of what it means to be part of a massive demonstration to protest against what we did not want.
What Murphison Morobe and his colleagues did not want back then was the forced teaching of the white Afrikaans language in the black schools of Soweto. What happened to them changed the history of South Africa.
The police began to shoot into the crowd, unprovoked as it were, and that changed, in fact, the mood of the crowd almost immediately.
2 died that first day, June 16, 1976. Over the next 16 months, between 600 and 1,000 black youths would be killed by the security forces in Soweto and in black townships across the country. Since then, nothing has been the same. So powerful is the specter of Soweto that last Thursday the white government imposed a nationwide state of emergency to clamp down on expected 10th anniversary commemorations. Anti-apartheid leaders of all stripes, some 2,000 of them, are now in jail under rules so strict it is a crime for the press even to list their names or to quote opponents of the state of emergency. Today, virtually the only white gesture of support permitted by government authorities was the gathering of flowers by white churchgoers to mark the decade-old bloodshed. Today, an estimated 90% of the 6.3 million black workers staged a massive stay away from work. Downtown Johannesburg was still, and a black journalist reported from Soweto that the huge black township of 2 million was all but deserted, almost, he said, as if the community was in mourning. The memory of the Soweto uprising haunts the white government precisely because so much in recent South Africa flows from those days. The killing shocked many whites out of complacency and divided the white community irrevocably about whether and how to change. They divided the black community irrevocably about how to fight apartheid. And they swung the spotlight of world condemnation irrevocably at South Africa. Worldwide demonstrations against the Pretoria government have been commonplace for years, but now the pressure for action is increasing. Last week, a high-ranking delegation from the Commonwealth nations issued a call for sanctions against South Africa. In the United States, where the Reagan administration still opposes sanctions, the momentum is clear. 51 U.S. companies have pulled out of South Africa in the past 18 months, and giants such as IBM and Xerox are threatening to do the same. In 5 years, American investment in South Africa has dropped from $2.6 billion to $1.3 billion. 27 of the top 100 banks bar all loans to South Africa. Today, the Bank of America, second biggest in the country, joined the list. Bank loans to South Africa are down $600 million in a year and a half. 54 cities now restrict the use of public funds for companies and banks with South African interests, and more than 100 colleges have done the same. Moreover, 91 top South African companies have publicly urged their government to end apartheid, and some prominent South Africans now openly urge sanctions against their own country.
I suppose when you go into a fight, you're not quite sure what the outcome will be, but you use every means at your power to win it, and that is what the black leaders see in regard to sanctions at the present time.
We are not a nation of weaklings. We do not desire it, and we do not seek it. But if we are forced to go it alone, then so be it.
But the threat to South Africa is more than economic. Last December, a bomb outside Durban killed 5 whites. a once unimaginable assault on white security. Last Saturday, a car bomb in Durban killed 3 whites. Perhaps ironically, the divisions among blacks after Soweto have escalated into murderous black-on-black violence. Only last week, pitched battles between young militants and other blacks left the Crossroads settlement near Cape Town a bloody battlefield. Just since last Thursday, 28 blacks have died, most at the hands of other blacks.
Violence will spread and the bloodshed will spread until it becomes a war without any front, any set lines, but scattered and smoldering throughout the country.
For nearly 40 years, the world has heard that time is running out for apartheid, and Pretoria's leaders say they're committed to change. But 10 years after the bloodshed began in Soweto, there's little sign that the government has the will or the ability to negotiate a real end to racial supremacy. So today, Murphy Morobi hides from the police. Today, a new generation of black youths, far more radical than Morobi's, flees from the clubs and guns. And today, the fear grows that what happened a decade ago could be a prelude to a battle whose casualties are all but unimaginable. Jeff Greenfield for Nightline in New York.
Reporters this weekend got their first independent look inside South Africa's black townships since the emergency was declared. By the government's own count now, 55 people nationwide have died. The appearance of calm here is deceptive, since cameras are still barred from areas of unrest. Since last week's crackdown began, it's estimated 4,000 black activists, journalists, clergymen, and union officials may have been arrested. Virtually all black leaders are either in jail or in hiding, but reporters have been unable to confirm names, numbers, anything.
Could you tell us the reasons why you will not be divulging the total number of people arrested?
No.
Draconian censorship rules have prompted local newspapers to delete stories, but the government has warned some editors the blank spaces themselves are subversive. And in places, it has even banned T-shirts bearing the names of anti-apartheid groups. However, this much is known. On Monday, most black workers stayed home. A nationwide work stoppage on the 10th anniversary of the Soweto uprising was apparently successful. Business leaders say strikes are continuing and have swept some of South Africa's major food chains, forcing white managers to do the work usually relegated to blacks. Top white businessmen have denounced the government.
A legacy of bitterness is being created. If people are locked up, then released, and never tried, these are the people that we ultimately have to negotiate with as management.
Outside Cape Town, at the Crossroads squatters camp, thousands of blacks have been left homeless from the recent fighting there between rival black gangs. And some of the refugees this week were ordered out of relief centers because they're on white land. Terry Waite, the Archbishop of Canterbury's envoy, has appealed to the government.
Can you really push people around like that and get away with it forever?
President Bota's government Friday, far from heeding calls to end the emergency and negotiate with blacks, gave police sweeping new legal powers that could make the emergency decrees unnecessary. Botha may have shored up support among right-wing whites, but he has turned his back on world opinion. Nobel laureate Bishop Desmond Tutu this week defied government restrictions and was interviewed by ABC's Peter Jennings.
The South African government is fully aware that they can cock a snoot at the world. It doesn't really matter what they do. President Reagan will be the very first to give us a whole spiel about his abhorrence of apartheid, but he will then not take any action that would indicate that abhorrence.
As last week's emergency went into effect, the British Commonwealth's Eminent Persons Group warned that economic sanctions against South Africa might now be the only way, quote, to avert what could be the worst bloodbath since World War II.
If the policies of America and Britain, Germany, do not change, there will be decisions that lead to total guerrilla contest, and that means soft targets will be hit, the loss of life will be massive, and in the view of the report, running into millions.
But Britain's Margaret Thatcher saw little point in sanctions.
I think it would lead to resistance to change and to much more violence and bloodshed.
And U.S. officials this week agreed.
To just pull out means that we sort of cop out. Where are you when you're not there anymore?
We've got to have a continuing ability through our presence there to influence events at the margins, which is all that we can do.
In the U.S., a number of eminent Americans, including Randall Robinson, head of Trans-Africa, were arrested after handcuffing themselves to the railing of the South African embassy. And there were calls for sanctions in the Congress.
We must make this statement. We must cleanse ourselves in this country, and we must assert our role in the international community as a nation committed to the dignity of people.
All those in favor will say aye.
To everyone's surprise, the House passed a bill that would force the nearly 300 U.S. companies in South Africa to leave and would embargo all trade. It's given little chance of Senate passage and was immediately denounced.
Now is the time to proceed with positive prompting, not forcing the far radicals of the white and the black extremes into deeper intransigence.
Nevertheless, events in South Africa suggested to many that the administration's policy of constructive engagement or friendly persuasion towards South Africa had failed, and that with the battle now joined, the U.S. and its allies must now choose sides, a view South African blacks have had for some time.
I want you to know each time we lower a coffin to the ground, the conspirators to that matter are the Reagans and the Thatchers.
Has U.S. policy in South Africa been outrun by events? And at what point does applying friendly persuasion on Pretoria become useless, even harmful to U.S. interests? The administration says that point hasn't been reached yet, but the week seems to have brought it uncomfortably closer.
The bodies we are burying every day mark the final phase of our struggle. This is now the right time to take your country. It does not matter what the cost is.
Yes.
Guerrilla.
Yes, yes.
Do you see that?
Yes.
Guerrilla.
Yes, yes.
We are here to carry your mandate to overthrow this government.
Triangle R.
When you have led the kind of life we lead in South Africa, where the country itself is a prison for the oppressed people, there is hardly a darker hour than the other, because your very life is determined by apartheid. Your very color is a commitment.
In the miserable townships where black South Africans are forced to live, they call her the mother of the nation, the mother of Africa. They also call her simply Winnie. Her flamboyant dress and hairstyle may change from day to day, but the intensity of the often dangerously adoring crowds is constant. At the age of 50, she has become an anti-apartheid superstar, partly because she's the wife of South Africa's most famous political prisoner, partly because she has thrust herself to the front rank of the black liberation movement, leading the increasingly impatient cries for power, Amandla. But suddenly this year, Winnie seemed overwhelmed by her celebrity status, swept away by the violent euphoria of young township radicals, and among other things, their fiery form of street execution. It's called the necklace. Blacks accused of collaborating with the white government, sometimes on the flimsiest evidence, are burned alive. Gasoline-soaked car tires placed over their shoulders, pinning their arms. Winnie Mandela clearly, deliberately, uncharacteristically seemed to endorse the necklace as a legitimate weapon of the anti-apartheid movement.
With our necklaces, we shall liberate this country.
That statement drew bitter criticism, and at first, Winnie denied making it. But in her next public appearance, she defiantly answered the critics.
There has been hysteria and demands that we explain ourselves. We owe no apology to any white racist.
The necklace speech reverberated across South Africa. Moderate blacks, as well as whites in the anti-apartheid movement, were appalled. by Mrs. Mandela's apparent endorsement of the cruel and deadly black-on-black township brutality. In one day of runaway rhetoric, Winnie Mandela seemed to have destroyed the heroic image built up over a quarter-century of her own non-violent suffering.
The wealth of this country belongs to you!
It is Mrs. Mandela's constant defiance of white authority which has endeared her to the township protesters.
We are fighting for our land, and we are going to get our land.
But fighting words, revolutionary rhetoric, can arouse uncontrollable emotions in South Africa today. A funeral for a tribal chief in Leandra Township. He was murdered, these people firmly believe, by another township resident working for the police.
The people who have killed Chief Mr. Maisa, they work hand in hand with police.
This is what happened after the funeral. Youngsters went to the home of the alleged collaborator, then killed his son. This sort of brutality is a regular occurrence in the townships now. Very often it ends with the ritualistic necklace.
It is of no consequence what the Botha regime thinks of how we fight our struggle, because apartheid in the first place is a criminal act against mankind.
But during our interview, Mrs. Mandela avoided a direct response to the question of whether or not she now endorses black-on-black violence.
Unfortunately, there were no doubts from my people what I meant about that speech. And just for your information, no, I don't have to apologize to any white South African. I don't have to apologize to criminals who are in fact responsible for thousands and thousands of deaths of my people, who are dripping with the blood of my innocent people who haven't got arms to fight the might of Pretoria.
What we are seeing here is not a war of white against black or black against white. What we are seeing here is not an issue of apartheid. We are seeing the warfare of the international capitalist, communist conspirators against the raising up of the living Christ in black and white alike in South Africa. We are seeing the full cooperation of international bankers, multinational corporations, and the media in portraying an image of South Africa that is not true. You have seen a collection of news clips designed to mold your mind to rise up and join the Soviet Union and its betrayers in America in the destruction of South Africa as a nation. And what you are seeing is the programming of America and the world against a nation that has been successful, and more so than any other nation in Africa in modern time. I am going to give you the facts and figures as our research team has collected them, as our keepers of the flame in South Africa have told them to us. You may do your own research and your own verification. Wherever you position yourself in this issue, we must unite together today to defeat the fallen ones whose greatest fear is that the individual sons and daughters of God may rise up and take their independence against this world totalitarian force. The beginning and the ending of South Africa depends on you, keepers of the flame. It depends on the light bearers of the world uniting through that all-seeing eye of God, so that we come to understand what are the facts and the real issues that are being outplayed. I am determined that when you have a spare moment during this conference in this sanctuary to continue your decrees, that you will have the inserts necessary to make your personal calls on the situation. If you think in any way that the facts I bring to you today are somehow not representative of the truth, I ask you to prove to me that they are not true, and if you prove yourselves correct, I will certainly change the facts that I have at hand. I can only report to you what I have seen and what I have been told, and what is the perspective of the Brotherhood on the world takeover of this international capitalist communist conspiracy. I could have addressed the subject of Afghanistan, Mozambique, Angola, Nicaragua, Cuba, Eastern Europe, or communist China today. But I have chosen South Africa because it is a pivotal issue in the history of the 20th century. As you know, I am familiar with the continent of Africa, having been in Ghana and Liberia, also in the Middle East, in the Holy Land, and to Egypt. That familiarity does not extend as yet to South Africa. I have not been there in person. I do not know if Saint Germain will send me. But I wish to give you this information because we must know how great is the lie. Here you can see a map of the world with South Africa as it is positioned on the southern tip of the African continent. It is the mother chakra of the entire continent. It is a very special and beautiful place where many wonderful people, both black and white, are living. As we have seen, there is tremendous change going on. It is a world and a nation in transition. And whether it will emerge as an integrated, stable, prosperous, and democratic nation with freedom for all, or follow the lead of its neighbors and enter a period of bloody revolution and chaos and be drawn into the Soviet orbit, remains to be seen. Which of these two scenarios will be the outcome depends on the Christ in you and me and the light bearers of the world. After our Vancouver seminar, I stopped over at the World's Fair. I went through a few pavilions, most notably the US and the USSR. And as I stood there, centered in the pavilion of the Soviet Union, I meditated upon the Lord God Almighty, and He gave to me the vision of the threefold flame, the simple threefold flame that we see depicted in our Science of the Spoken Word book. And this threefold flame expanded, and He said to me, God in you is greater by the threefold flame. Therefore, let us know this today, because the threefold flame of life is the flame that we keep. And today, for a moment, let us be keepers of the flame in South Africa. There is no question that the United States will play a major role in determining the outcome. Our actions depend upon our perception of the crisis. Therefore, the all-seeing eye of God must be upon us and upon the nation. There are different ways of looking at the crisis. Let us take the first scenario. South Africa is run by a white racist minority government which is trying to prevent the black majority from gaining economic and political enfranchisement to protect its own economic and political interests. Problems and violence will continue till government makes amends. This is the apartheid model. So its argument goes as follows. The ruling 4.5 million whites make up only 16% of South Africa's 28 million people. But the 20 million blacks, which make up 72% of the population, have no political rights or representation. They are confined to homelands, scattered areas comprising 13% of South Africa's land, and are forbidden to purchase property outside the reserves. The colored areas that you see on the slides are the areas marked homelands. By forcing blacks out of white areas and into these economically unviable homelands, then revoking their citizenship and recognizing the homelands as sovereign countries, whites are attempting to, in effect, once more become a majority in South Africa. When working outside of their homelands, blacks are forced to live in poor, squalid townships separate from white areas. This is what I am telling you, the apartheid model of how this world establishment wants us to view the equation. They receive lower wages than whites, lower educational standards, and must attend segregated schools. Black welfare has been irreparably handicapped by apartheid, and the government shows little or no sign of making real changes. Thus, the blacks have turned to violence, and the world community has more or less ostracized the nation. Pressure will continue until South African whites face up to the realities and grant the blacks the vote and proportional say in their government. Finally, the South African government is at fault for both the violence and the apartheid and should be punished. This model explains a certain amount of South Africa's problems, but ignores the historical context of the situation. First of all, it is a gross oversimplification to see the conflict in South Africa merely in terms of white against black. Whites acknowledge that they are prisoners of history who inherited a system and a mentality of separation. The South African government's policy is that apartheid must go. It is in the process of determining the best way to dismantle it. The situation cannot be described as whites having come in and taken over land belonging to the blacks. When the Dutch first arrived in South Africa, about 30 years after the Mayflower landed at Plymouth Rock, they did not meet blacks, but Hottentots and Bushmen. It wasn't until 100 years after arriving in South Africa that Dutch settlers who had migrated north clashed with black tribes, Bantu farmers migrating south. The Dutch Afrikaners were not colonialists who came to get rich and go home. They came to Africa to stay and to consider themselves Africans. They have as much right to live in South Africa as Americans have to live in America. The blacks, whom we generally tend to look at solely in terms of race, are made up of 10 separate ethnic groups, none of whom would consent to be ruled over by another group. Considering their skin color a unifying factor is like considering the white skin of Europeans a unifying factor. These tribes, with 4 major languages and 23 minor ones, are as diverse as the different European nations. Their history of conflict may be compared to the continuous wars that have racked Europe for centuries. The Zulu tribe is the largest, consisting of 5.5 million people. It is divided into about 200 tribes. Next come the Xhosa, with 250,000, another almost 250,000 for the North Soto, just over 1.5 million for the South Soto, 1,200,000 for the Swana, and 7 other main groups. The white community is similarly divided with 2 official languages, English and Afrikaans, and ethnic groups ranging from Dutch to French, English, German, Jew, Portuguese, Greek, and Italian. Another piece to the puzzle are the coloreds, or those of mixed race, and the Indians, divided into Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, and other cultures. To this apartheid model, the South African government counters that the Homeland's policy did not grow up as a means to intimidate blacks, but rather as a method of avoiding the conflicts that have resulted from religious, ethnic, language, and cultural barriers elsewhere. South Africa decided to attempt to divide itself into independent black and white states, each living according to its own cultural traditions and mores, instead of sharing political power between black and white in a single unit. Although the homelands present only 13% of the land, they also represent fully half of the arable land and contain a good amount of valuable minerals. This is a map of the rainfall. The purple area has the most rainfall. The South African government recognizes that apartheid is totally unsatisfactory and that South Africa must change or die. In the words of its president, Peter Botha, they have determined that the Constitution is wrong and must be rewritten to provide for black representation at the highest level. Since 1978, many of the apartheid laws have been abolished. The government considers that it has gone 90% of the journey toward eradicating apartheid, in theory, if not in practice, and will complete it in the next 3 years. The media has persistently characterized the recent removal of petty apartheid, separate buses, drinking fountains, elevators, movie theaters, and eating establishments, as merely cosmetic. But the Consul General of South Africa here in Los Angeles observed, these changes are precisely the ones heralded as landmarks in your own civil rights movement. Why are they landmarks in your country and cosmetic in ours? While many are skeptical as to the speed with which South Africa will end apartheid, it is clear that none of the proposed U.S. measures will make the slightest difference. Divestment hurts blacks because it creates unemployment. Have you noticed that no one who supports it is going to lose his job over it? Apartheid is an economic and an educational problem rather than a political one. South Africa must close the first 2 gaps between whites and blacks before it can end the political discrimination. Some Western experts believe significant changes have been made. In September '85, Paul Johnson wrote in commentary, "There is overwhelming evidence that South Africa has been moving away from apartheid. Some of it was always a dead letter. Other aspects are no longer enforced. The fact that over 10 million blacks live and work in areas officially designated white shows that the physical core of apartheid has been surrendered. At the rate things have been moving, apartheid could be dead and officially buried in 5 years. Even the worst case scenario that South Africa was planning to take 20 years to eradicate apartheid and end its state of emergency is no excuse for replacing an imperfect but reformable government with one that would most likely be violent and repressive. You will remember that in the days of the Bolshevik Revolution, for a considerable period of years, the czars were implementing democratic reforms. It was of no concern to the Bolsheviks. They pressed on for their communist revolution. We will see the same parallel taking place in South Africa. The media then is highly responsible for the tremendous blanket of misinformation, disinformation that is across America and the world. They have focused more on South Africa in the past 2 years than on any other foreign nation. Over the past decade, they have given it an inordinate amount of attention. Consider that in 1975, the year Pol Pot killed 1 million of his own citizens in Cambodia, in that year, the New York Times and the Washington Post together carried 147 articles on Chile, 96 on South Korea, 1 on North Korea, 7 on Cuba, 13 on Cambodia, and 512 on South Africa. Without a doubt, the media campaign on South Africa is orchestrated. These things don't just happen. They are planned, and they are planned for a purpose. And remember, the ultimate purpose is to put out the Christ consciousness of a nation. This is what we must realize, or we will never understand the conspiracy that is moving against Nicaragua, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Angola, South Korea, Taiwan, and on and on. India and the United States. To be sure, the South African government has been responsible for violence. But the African continent has been full of unreported and underreported violence. Idi Amin, in his rule from 1971 to 79, killed at least 300,000 of his citizens. In 1975 in Ethiopia, Mariam, with his palace guard of 12,000 Cuban troops, began his reign of red terror, which ended in the deaths of 100,000 of his own citizens, including the entire graduating class of the high schools of Addis Ababa. After a Uganda coup which ended this January, reports of killing fields like those in Cambodia filtered out. Last year's coverage of the Ethiopian famine also almost totally ignored the fact that the Soviet-backed dictatorship was deliberately withholding food from hundreds of thousands of its own citizens in order to quell opposition. And so in Ethiopia, the Soviets gave food to those who were pro-Soviet and starved those who were the real spirits of freedom and light bearers. And when the United States sent food to Ethiopia, the Soviets removed the US labels and put on that food their own. The unwarranted attention the media gives to the most minor of incidents in South Africa can lead to only one conclusion. They have an unspoken bias which can only be termed racism. Their viewpoint seems to be that it doesn't matter what the black-ruled African nations do, they're uncivilized. But the whites should know better. What conclusion then can we draw from the skewed reporting in the United States media? They are attempting to influence policy by misinforming the American citizenry. Here are just a few of the views of South Africa that don't get on TV. This is the Johannesburg skyline. This is Cape Point, the tip of the peninsula. If you meditate upon this, you can feel the ancient light that was here long before the last 1,000 years and prior generations ever appeared on this land. This is an African settlement in one of the tribal homelands. the Transkei. This is a Dutch Reformed church. This is blacks and whites at the beach enjoying the Mozambique current. This is a view of Golden Gate in the Orange Free State. It is significant that the press failed to report in any great numbers on a recent remark by Desmond Tutu, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize and much lauded as a man of moderation. In January on WNBC TV in New York, he said that in the event of a black-white civil war, blacks would have the following recourse. We are the domestics. We take care of white people's homes. We cook the food and take care of their babies. Some of the domestics could be recruited and given a vial of arsenic. Who knows what could happen? That is Bishop Desmond Tutu, the winner then of this Nobel Peace Prize. Biased Western news coverage has helped to foster the following misconceptions, which it would be good to set straight before we continue. The following list comes from a newsletter by Donald S. McIlvaney, who recently returned from a fact-finding mission to the region. Here then is South Africa. And this is what he says. South Africa is a police state. This is clearly an exaggeration. For every 1,000 people, there are 1.4 policemen in South Africa, 2.2 in the United Kingdom, 3.5 in Israel, 4.3 in New York, and 10 in Moscow. The South African police force numbers 35,469, of which 16,292 are whites, and 19,177 are blacks, coloreds, and Asians. You can see both blacks and whites on this Defense Force patrol against terrorists. South Africa does have very strong internal security and will jail or restrict the movement of anyone advocating the violent overthrow of its government. This a government has the right to do. It's called treason. Now, this list is statements that are touted in the press, believed by most Americans, if not all, and the facts are what he found when he went to South Africa. The blacks hate the whites. This is simply not true. Black-white relations are better overall in South Africa than in the United States or Great Britain, which have both experienced severe race riots over the past 15 to 20 years. A white man is safer walking down a street in Soweto or another black township than in Harlem, Watts, Liberty City in Miami, in downtown Detroit, or other major U.S. cities. American visitors are amazed at how blacks smile at them on the streets, something that they are not used to in the United States. The blacks live in abject poverty. South African blacks have a higher standard of living, own more homes, cars, and businesses than any other blacks in Africa. Soweto, the largest township outside Johannesburg, is made up of homes, most built at white taxpayer expense, far nicer than most of America's ghettos. South African black wages are 3 to 4 times higher than Africa to the north, and as a result, over 500,000 blacks try to immigrate into South Africa each year from other parts of Africa. Another misstatement is that whites badly mistreat the blacks. On the contrary, 1 million white taxpayers, 200,000 colored taxpayers, and 200,000 Indian taxpayers support 11 million blacks with their taxes. Blacks pay no income tax in South Africa. The whites subsidize black housing, medicine, and schools with their taxes. In South Africa, a black can have an open heart surgery for 1 rand, which costs a white 15,000 rand. Another statement of misinformation is that less is spent on black education than on white. This is probably true, but white, colored, and Indian taxes pay for their own education as well as black education. In South Africa, 80% of black children are at school versus 68% in Zambia, 43% in Tanzania, and 44% in Nigeria. During the last 5 years, the South African government has tripled expenditures on education. Blacks are denied trade union membership, another statement of misinformation. Total black trade union membership in South Africa exceeds 1.3 million. Blacks have full trade union rights in more than 77 trade unions. Another misstatement, South Africa faces a terrorist bloodbath. Terrorist incidents in 1982, South Africa 39, USA 51, France 112, in one 30-day period, Northern Ireland 1,047. South Africa's internal security forces are very capable and have kept this global problem to a minimum in their country. Another misstatement, one man, one vote will solve all of South Africa's problems. The fact is that it hasn't solved the problems of any other black African state. Most all have ended up as dictatorships in spite of elections. If the West is going to insist on one man, one vote for South Africa, then why not also for Red China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and most of the Third World? Why aren't we insisting on the vote for all women in Muslim countries like Saudi Arabia? Neither men nor women vote there. The biggest problem you have in the turning over of African nations to the natives or Africans is seen in the history of Africa in the last 35, 40 years. The dictatorships have come in either as military or political. Those who win in a free election are subject to being murdered by those who lose. You have not seen stability, but only brutality. I would like to see the franchise given to every South African citizen. I would like to see it given when there is rooted out of South Africa the tremendous forces of Soviet Marxism in a premeditated step-by-step takeover of the nation through the black townships. Right now, the push for one man, one vote in South Africa is being done by the Soviet Union to topple the entire regime, its entire foundation, and to create another chaos and anarchy of a Bolshevik revolution where the totalitarian government of the communism rises up and rules the nation, and everyone become its slaves. Another misstatement, South Africa's blacks are just like ours, and their racial problems can be solved just like our own. The United States does not have blacks as in Africa, but mulattoes or coloreds as they are called in South Africa. South African blacks are tribal, even the ones living in the cities. The United States so-called blacks are not tribal. They tell me they are Americans. They tell me they are keepers of the flame, freedom fighters, and light bearers. I do not see the color of their skin because their auras are so bright. This is a tribal dance. Minors on weekend recreation. Over 1,500 witch doctors serve the black community in Soweto. The blacks of America are not dominated or served by, nor do they support witch doctors. In 1983, lightning struck and killed a black in a small township in South Africa. The local witch doctor accused 4 people, 2 men and 2 women, of being responsible for the lightning strike. All 4 were burned to death by frenzied blacks. There is a difference. America and Africa are not the same. It is naive to think so. I'll never forget the impression received by the black cameraman who accompanied me to Ghana. He was clearly both outraged, amused, and disgusted with the behavior of the blacks in Ghana. He felt no part of their vibration, their evolution, or their mentality. He felt totally American and was actually embarrassed to consider himself the product of that type of a society. Now, while the apartheid model of explaining South Africa's problems does explain some tensions, it is true, it is far from explaining the violence and resultant state of emergency that exists. If resistance to apartheid were the motor behind all violence in South Africa, one would expect it to decrease rather than increase, as the system was and is being dismantled. Clearly, the situation is not a US-type civil rights struggle. For one thing, the United States' worst race riots never saw the kind of black-on-black violence that has been steadily increasing in South Africa. Why are blacks killing blacks in South Africa? Why are they killing one another when they should be united on one purpose, and that is to establish this one man, one vote and the dismantling of the system? What the international capitalist communist conspirators would have us do in very basic terms is to throw out the baby with the bathwater. A nation that is wealthy, that has tremendous resources, that has a stable situation of government, of military, of education, is fully capable of making the transition of the breakdown of apartheid. If left alone by the conspiracies of East and West, who see in the struggle that whenever there is a struggle, whenever there is change, someone must benefit. And they are there to see that it is they who benefit from change, at the expense of life and perhaps the loss of millions of lives, as that scenario is constantly before us in the media. Even I, who know the facts, when I see the news clips in the evening, wonder if it would be safe for me to walk down the streets of Johannesburg. And yet keepers of the flame there tell me, of course, it is safe for you to walk down the streets of Johannesburg. The current struggle over apartheid should not be judged in terms of the American civil rights movement, said one American black who has traveled extensively in Africa. If you had Martin Luther King, Eldridge Cleaver, Huey Newton, and Stokely Carmichael all trying to kill each other, then maybe you could compare them. Such is not the case. Much of the violence we see on TV today is a result of the South African government attempting to halt radical blacks from killing moderates. Who are the radical blacks and who are the moderates? We have taught in our teachings on the ancient evolutions of Africa and of Atlantis that angels of light and angels of darkness infiltrated the culture of Africa and took embodiment in the black races, in the black tribes. Angels came down and embodied among the people to be their teachers, their defenders, and their advocates. Fallen angels took embodiment to destroy the race and their potential for the realization of Christhood. It is true in every race, in every nation throughout the world. There is the good seed and the bad seed. And here you see the lines clearly drawn between those moderates who are prepared to stand with the government for peaceful change and the true alchemy of the new age, and you see the radicals who have been radicalized by the Soviet Union, who wave the communist banners and are blatant in their statements that they are part of the world communist revolution. This you do not hear about in the news. You simply will never hear of a situation of the finger being pointed at Soviet infiltration and takeover at the root of the problem in these homelands. As Zulu chief Buthelezi said, blacks employing violence are using it against blacks more than against apartheid. Violence is dividing black South Africa. Blacks are not uniting under the banners of violence. Black violence is usually intended as a deterrent to cooperation with the government. One popular form of execution conducted by radical black youths or comrades is necklacing, as you have heard that Winnie Mandela has advocated. This is a slide of a man being necklaced. The victim's hands are tied, sometimes with barbed wire. Newsweek reported June 2nd, one rubber tire is put around his neck and another around his legs. They are soaked with gasoline and set ablaze. Yes, it surely is a horrible way to die, says killer, a 16-year-old comrade. They call themselves comrades because they are part of the world communist revolution. But the people we necklace have committed horrible crimes and deserve to die horribly. Killer related how he helped to necklace a 62-year-old woman, Mary Shosana, who worked in a funeral parlor. Since she sold funeral insurance, he said, she was part of the system. We knew she was a police informer, Killer recounted coolly. We did not need proof. She was pleading for mercy and crying and screaming. She said she'd pay us 7,000 rands, $3,080 if we let her go. We told her we didn't need her money, we needed her life. What they needed was her light. That is why there is always bloodshed in a Bolshevik revolution. The murder and slaying of the people is an exhilarating experience to the murderer because he drinks in the life essence that comes from the blood of the light bearer. In every communist revolution, there are mass murders. The light bearers must be murdered because if it is a system of justice and equality, the fallen ones never win. So they must eliminate their enemy, and it's the greatest cowardice of all. It's the coyote consciousness. Then we put a tire around her legs and another around her neck and shoulders. We forced her to drink petrol. We poured the rest into the tires and onto her and set her alight, but the fire went out. Another tin of petrol was fetched, and it took about an hour. If you can imagine such absence of mercy, you can imagine and understand what is the black heart of a fallen angel, and it has nothing to do with the color of skin. There is nothing of Jesus Christ, Mohammed, Gautama Buddha, or any of the really great sons and daughters of Afra who have lived upon this continent. How can you justify doing this to your own people in the name of overthrowing an apartheid system which day by day is making progress? Something more, much more vile is at stake. It is demons out of death and hell who are in embodiment, who are determined to destroy the light of the light bearer. There is only one weapon against it, the sacred word, the sword that proceeds out of the mouth of the faithful and true, the Word and his armies of heaven, whose representative in your life is your own holy Christ self. Certain keepers of the flame in West Germany have challenged the judgment call and the Archangel Michael rosary in recent months because it was not loving. I can ask you, keepers of the flame, is it loving or not to demand the judgment of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ upon such murderers as these, who will burn this man alive? Not only will they burn him alive, but they will eat his roasted flesh, and they will eat it before he is dead. Such violence is basically terrorism directed against moderate blacks seeking a peaceful solution in South Africa by radical blacks whose goal is violent revolution. It has no parallel in the United States civil rights movement, none whatsoever. Now the Lord Jesus Christ, in the hour of the Last Supper, gave the empowerment to the apostles to judge the 12 tribes and also the fallen angels, as recorded by the Apostle Paul, who spoke directly to Jesus. This is in the Bible. It is the Christ of you and me and the Lord Jesus Christ who is the judge. This call allows the mighty archangels and the hosts of our Lord and Savior to enter in, and where justice fails in binding the serpent and his seed and exorcising these devils from society, the angels of God do not fail. This is our only recourse in an age when the international capitalist communist conspirators are moving nation by nation to exterminate all light bearers from the face of the earth. You should know that the most powerful presence and organization of the light bearers in the world today is Saint Germain's Keepers of the Flame Fraternity and this Church Universal and Triumphant, which is truly universal on the face of the earth. There is no other body of light bearers who have seen through and past and beyond the cries of peace and love, whether of the New Age or the liberal movement, who fail to realize we are in a battle of Armageddon and that there are embodied devils who will destroy the earth and a way of life if there is not an intercession by the entire spirit of the Great White Brotherhood. This is the cry of my heart. I cannot bear to see Soviet communism with the full cooperation of American capitalists and representatives in our government and our media, nullifying and neutralizing the most important issue of our time, which is the raising up of the Christ in all people of South Africa. And when that Christ is raised up, the government upon the shoulder of that Christ will give the vote to every man and woman, regardless of race or prior background before they came to that soil. We must consider, and consider profoundly, that if the international capitalist communist conspiracy is successful in South Africa and the other nations I have named, how then will Americans who are so misinformed and misunderstanding of the issues meet the same challenge when it comes upon our own soil? This is the greatest concern upon our hearts and why we gather to this conference this 4th of July. Again, this is a map of Africa. A second model to explain the situation is that the Soviet Union is attempting to take over by fomenting communist revolution in South Africa. The Soviet Union is attempting to take over by fomenting communist revolution in South Africa. Proponents of this model explain Soviet strategy in South and Southern Africa as follows. to surround and isolate South Africa with Soviet surrogate states: Angola, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, eventually Namibia, Botswana, Zaire, and Zambia, after Jonas Savimbi is toppled in Angola. To precipitate global economic sanctions and disinvestment to weaken and destabilize the country internally, harass South Africa along her four-country 1,700-mile border, initiate terrorism and intimidation, first against blacks and then whites, and finally to foment internal revolution to overthrow the existing power structure, white and/or black, and establish their surrogate, the African National Congress, as the new government of the Democratic People's Republic of Azania. The Democratic People's Republic of Azania. It will, of course, be no more democratic than the current communist governments in Angola, Mozambique, or Zimbabwe, or for that matter, throughout Black Africa. This slide shows growing Soviet influence in the area. The dark green shaded nations received over $1 billion in arms from 1977 to 84. Blue represents the areas of Soviet naval penetration. What is the Soviet motive? Because of South Africa's crucial geopolitical positioning, the Soviet Union is highly motivated in establishing a base here. The Cape of Good Hope is the choke point for 80% of the West's minerals, 80% of Western Europe's oil, half of the United States' imported oil and resources, and 75% of the world's tanker tonnage. With the United States and the West allowing the Soviet Union to make her way to the warm waters of the Mediterranean through Afghanistan, now the Soviet Union desires to control this Cape of Good Hope, South Africa. Having been given the Panama Canal turned over to the communist regime of Panama a number of years ago, we can see that the Soviet Union is after the choke points of the world. This map shows world shipping routes in proportion to the volume of oil carried around South Africa. You can see how it is heaviest trafficking around that Cape of Good Hope. The Soviet Union already controls or influences all African countries along the Indian Ocean from Ethiopia on down, except South Africa and Kenya. That's on the right side of Africa, as you see the map. Both South Africa and Kenya have serious difficulties of fomenting internal Marxist revolutions fomented by Soviet agents. The United States is a naval power and needs a friendly nation at the Cape to ensure safe passage for our fleets. South Africa has already cut back on the protection it gives to ships navigating the southern tip of Africa. Some 5,000 miles of the Cape shipping route is now lacking any significant Western naval presence. This shows world gold production, with South Africa and the USSR leading. Another reason why the Soviet Union would want to control South Africa is for her mineral wealth, particularly strategic minerals, gold and diamonds. By conquering South Africa, the Soviets could control 67% of the world annual gold output. This is gold production. South Africa has the world's largest known deposits of chromium, manganese, platinum, vanadium, and gold. This is a slide of the mines. In many of these, the second largest producers is the Soviet Union. Therefore, if the Soviets took over South Africa, they would control 99% of the world's platinum reserves, a metal used as a catalyst in making alloys. 97% of its vanadium used to make alloys such as steel. 93% of its manganese essential in producing steel. 93% of its chromium necessary for making stainless steel and other alloys. 50% of its fluorite, a substance used for fusing metals and making opaque glass, and 46% of its iron. This model does explain the internal turmoil of South Africa along a recognizable pattern of revolutions that have occurred in other countries, which can be broken down into several phases. Here, once again, the phases of communist takeover of a nation. In his largely suppressed book, The Shah's Story, the deposed Shah of Iran described the pattern of Soviet-orchestrated revolution which was used against Iran and later Nicaragua. We can clearly see that the pattern has begun in South Africa. First, the mass media is used to soften up world opinion and governments as to how evil and repressive the target regime is. Second, leftist religious leaders, because of their credibility, following, and general naivete, are drawn into the revolution to help lead the masses against the government. Third, the more the target government liberalizes conditions in its country, the more the revolutionaries use those changes as a sign of weakness and escalate their demands. This is evidenced by the following series of events. 1 year ago, Bishop Desmond Tutu called on the South African government to start dismantling apartheid by accomplishing the following: no influx control that applies only to blacks, massive investment in black education and training, an end to the denationalization of blacks, an end to forced removals. Tutu said, these conditions should be implemented within 18 to 24 months. If not, then for the first time, I will myself call for punitive economic sanctions. Have you ever heard the media in the United States tell you that Bishop Tutu is an extremely wealthy man, that his job is not at stake when there is an advocacy of the pulling out of Western corporations and companies, where millions of blacks are employed and where they derive their livelihood? Clearly, the removal of those businesses and foreign companies is the destabilization of South Africa, putting millions of blacks out of work into the streets, fomenting for a communist revolution. In April, the South African government announced in July 1986 it would abolish the pass laws, and legislation is being drafted to repeal influx controls. It has made education once more the largest single government expenditure in the 1986-87 budget. Spending on black education has increased 600% since 1980. It will, in this session of Parliament, 1986, restore South African citizenship to blacks who had earlier been denationalized, in order to achieve one citizenship for all South Africans. It has ordered an end to the forced resettlement of blacks. In spite of these changes, Bishop Tutu has joined the rest of the black leadership who continue to call for economic sanctions against South Africa. The fact that despite government concessions and attempts to change, violence continued shows clearly that the African National Congress, the ANC, at least does not desire gradual change but conforms to Soviet revolutionary principles. Fourth, The revolutionaries used bereavement tactics to create new mass demonstrations and violence at funerals each time a revolutionary or innocent victim is killed. We have seen this repeatedly in our newspapers and on TV in recent months. Here we see a red flag at the funeral for Peter Nkebeling, an opposition leader who died while being held by the police. Fifth, the gullible youth are drawn in, emotionally incited to violence, imbued with a feeling of power and sent out in violent gangs to attack moderate, anti-revolutionary targets. Sixth, the trained revolutionaries begin to pull out pre-positioned arms and explosives and attack police stations, government installations, power stations, to murder moderate leaders and move the country to the brink of chaos. Seventh, the revolutionaries incite school boycotts, strikes, and strike violence, escalating these to a general strike to paralyze the country. Eighth, the United States government appears on the scene, usually the State Department, to withdraw all support from the beleaguered ally, to ease out the faltering regime, i.e. to intimidate it into capitulation, to usher in the revolutionary government and put the best face possible on it, usually calling it a national democratic government. The first 7 steps in this pattern of Soviet-backed revolution are fully operative in South Africa today, and the 8th is progressively coming into play. Phase 8 has begun to accelerate. 2 days ago, the Reagan administration announced it was considering negotiating with the African National Congress. This Congress is Soviet-backed. Overlapping this pattern of revolution are 5 revolutionary phases. Phase 1, mobilizing or politicizing the masses. This phase involves mobilizing the masses at the grassroots level into consumer boycotts, labor strikes, school stayaways, community protests, civil disobedience, and passive resistance. Agitation over issues, real or fabricated, such as rents, bus fares, sanitation, work conditions, school rules, civil laws, etc., is used to stir up discontent among the masses. Phase 2, active resistance. This phase involves orchestration of demonstrations, boycotts, and strikes. Although these purport to be peaceful, they are designed to lead to violence and clashes with the law enforcement authorities. This has the effect of portraying the authorities as oppressive and alienating them from the masses. To further undermine the authorities, local government officials, tribal leaders, and police are killed while attempts are made to set up liberated areas. These are zones which are no longer controlled by the government and where insurgents have set up their own parallel government. This phase is designed to create a climate of collapse. This shows the Cape Town riots. Phase 3, guerrilla warfare. In this phase, terrorist activity is begun by guerrillas trained in warfare who return to the country to carry out attacks on strategic and economic targets, as well as on institutions regarded as representing the government authorities. Phase 4, mobile warfare. Large sections of the country fall under the control of the insurgents, providing them with secure rear bases needed to prepare regular soldiers. Their fighters are now divided into regular soldiers, guerrillas, and local militia. The regulars operate in sizable formations armed with conventional weapons, especially artillery. This phase ends with a capitulation of the target government and the installation of a new revolutionary regime. The toppling of the South African present regime today will be an event wherein a nation that has been free 400 years, very parallel in its people, in its beauty, in its climate to the United States, is destroyed by a Soviet Marxist revolution backed by our own government, the international bankers, the order, and the forces of Antichrist throughout the world. What is so stupendous about this plot is that it moves on, and Americans and American children in our schoolhouses do not know the formula of revolution. They are not taught the current history of their own century. They are not having diagrammed for them the diagram of the murder of nations by the Soviet Union that has continued since 1917. Therefore, they do not recognize the signs, and they are manipulated, the youth of this country, our college students, our universities, as much as the youth of South Africa. They have been mobilized to the streets to condemn the South African government without having any idea that in the process they are supporting the greatest enemies of mankind and the greatest enemies of the blacks themselves. That this can happen in a world today is astonishing to me. I have always been astonished that lies stick when the truth is so clear. You hear people tell a lie long enough, and many people believe it. We've seen that about our own organization, and those who've taken us into court, and those who simply continue to repeat the lie over and over and over again. And it is believed without proof, without investigation, without any desire to get to the bottom of why an individual would be repeating this lie on and on. This is happening in our world. We live on this planet, yet it is ununderstandable. I believe that the American people have remained as adolescents far into their adulthood, if not permanently, and that neither their religion, nor their education, nor their political representatives have taught them the true facts, and therefore they are not prepared to believe that there is absolute evil, that there are those who embody it, and that there are those who are determined to destroy the light of God in them. They have never been taught that they have a holy Christ self to defend, that they are light bearers, and that there are fallen ones who have attacked them for hundreds of thousands of years. So where do you start to educate a people, a nation, and a world who has practically no common denominator of understanding? You have to build from the very foundation of the pyramid. And that is where we start on our stump lectures and in our seminars to the nations. We have to start with the individual's relationship to Almighty God, establish it firmly so he will have the courage to look at that which opposes that relationship and stand, face, and conquer it. The conspiracy theory of history was debunked long ago. Reagan's idea of the Soviet Union as an evil empire was thrown out, and ultimately thrown out by himself. So everything is cliches, and if you say the wrong words, you are out. If you say the right words, you are in. And words don't even mean what they say. So we can see that upon the foundation of religion proceeds education, government, political theory, our philosophy, and our way of life. That foundation of that great pyramid on the dollar bill has been taken from our country. So we are making the attempt through our publications, through our speaking out, through our lectures, each and every one of us, everywhere we can, to inform people. It does not always seem as if we are making enough headway in an outer sense. But on inner planes, we truly have made headway with Archangel Michael and his legions. And because of the call, the dynamic decree, and your faithfulness, we are sitting here today. We are gathered once more, and we still have our Chapel of the Holy Grail. This is the first day of our conference, and you'll probably hear me say the following again, but I do want to say it to you at this time, because I've had two very profound experiences in recent weeks. One was the experience of our seminar in San Francisco, St. Germain on alchemy. I think the highest attendance we had at any one time at that conference was 750. As I saw this city as a profile of America and of a New Age city where I have been welcomed and received for many, many years with great crowds. Crowds who come for a night's lecture but don't always have the staying power. Nevertheless, wonderful people. I saw in this, which I felt was an insufficient response in this late hour of America's history. I saw profoundly in this experience that the light bearers of that city had not been sufficiently aroused by keepers of the flame there or by my ministry there, and that if this indeed was a cross-section of America, then I personally had failed to awaken my nation to that level of awakening that is necessary to save her. And for at least 2 days after that seminar, I was overcome with such a sorrow and a sadness in my heart. And Jesus comforted me and gave to me the vision of himself standing over Jerusalem and saying, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often I would have gathered you as a hen gathereth her chicks, but ye would not." Jesus had experienced that great sorrow of the non-responsiveness of Jerusalem. And here on this western shore, we have experienced similarly. So my heart grieves for my own nation, because I know that this nation is the key to victory. So as long as we have breath and life, you and I and all of us are going to inform America, North America, and determine that we will still use those hours remaining to us to achieve an enlightenment and a vision upon which the right action can be based. The second experience I had for about 48 hours was to feel upon me the full weight of the planet and its oncoming karma and dark cycle. And I groaned in my body, and I saw clearly it was not opposition, it was not any kind of projection, it was not any kind of part of the Armageddon in which we are engaged. It was simply the presence of the world weight and the oncoming karma that is descending. And this experience to me was a groaning in my being, a groaning not for the weight which I gladly carry, but a groaning for this world and what shall come upon you if the light bearers themselves have not been quickened to enter into this work, which is the mighty work of the ages. Therefore, I am tremendously comforted by your presence here and by the tremendous support of Keepers of the Flame around the world in this hour of our trial. It is a tremendous victory because it gives to the courts of heaven the evidence that many thousands of people do stand for Christ, the Christ in all of us, in the hour of trial. That we stand together, that I am not alone and you are not alone, and therefore progress has been made since the hour of Jesus' trial. Many, many, many more are enlightened by the Christ today than they were 2,000 years ago. The entrenched forces of darkness, however, are the same. And therefore, in the midst of all of this, I can only express to you my tremendous gratitude for our Royal Teton Ranch and the opportunity that it gives to us to reinforce our oneness and to use it as a base to send the light through the earth, through the water, through the fire in the earth, to all nations, when and if we are called to concentrate ourselves there. So it is wondrous to know that a base of light is established and that we may consider ourselves extensions from that divine mother's ship, that retreat of Lady Master Venus that was unveiled over the ranch this year. And that we, in fact, cannot see ourselves as alone or not tethered to a community or a force of light. That we are not lonely ones today. We are not like the freedom fighters in various nations who do not sense this tremendous backing and presence and a place to go to, a place of protection in time of trouble. And I have to be reminded that it is you, the keepers of the flame of the world, who have made that place possible. My greatest hope, then, today is in the keepers of the flame, not in the response or non-responsiveness that I have found here and there. The keepers of the flame make the difference. And I trust that we will see and sense how very close we are to the blacks and whites of South Africa. That you can, through these slides, literally stand where they stand and feel that it is God's country also. These are our people also, that we love them dearly. And in our finer bodies, our etheric body, we gladly place ourselves between them and the Soviet Marxist revolution attempting to destroy them. You know, in nations where that revolution is complete, people are hopeless, people are without the sense of God or any future. There is a general decay of consciousness that sets in where initiative and freedom is gone. So if you will bear with me, I would like to continue these facts so that you may use them in the most incisive descent of calling the needle rays of God into this nation. I will go on now with phase 5, consolidation. During this phase, the new revolutionary government consolidates its position. This involves creating the temporary facade of democracy and freedom to encourage aid from the gullible Western powers, disarming the population, nationalizing and controlling the means of production, controlling the mass media, trade unions, and churches. The elimination of all opposition and the imposition of a one-party state. All 5 of these revolutionary phases were implemented in the Cuban, Iranian, and Nicaraguan revolutions. The South African Revolution, as we will see below, is well advanced in phase 2 and is now entering phase 3. There is no mystery to a revolution. These tried and true phases and patterns have been used successfully by the communists for decades. What is it that makes the non-communist not want to fight against this creeping, crawling cancer? Have you ever known anyone who didn't want to know they had cancer? Who felt a problem and wouldn't go to a doctor? Who would rather not know and just quietly slip away? This is the insidious force of absolute evil. You must be very clear, keepers of the flame, as to what is absolute evil. It is the embodiment of absolute rebellion against Almighty God and His children by the fallen angels. It is not relative in any sense of the word. It is 100%, 1,000% dedicated to the destruction of your Christhood and to the great golden age of Saint Germain. Please read The Mysteries of the Holy Grail by Archangel Gabriel so that you know and understand this very principle of absolute good and absolute evil, and recognize it when you see it as a force committed to your personal destruction and the destruction of your soul. In this phase 5, there is the elimination of all opposition and the imposition of a one-party state. A one-party state. If South Africa, Central America, and the West are to survive, we must all learn to first recognize these steps, and second, to take decisive steps to stop them. This is the conclusion of McIlvaney. Now this is fighting the last enemy, which is death. Death puts up a tremendous resistance. It's very insidious. It enters our lives in many forms, and it is a beast that is so large. It's like having a large black python all coiled up inside. It doesn't want to be handled. You don't want to touch it. You'd rather live to accommodate it than have to get into the challenging of this substance, this animal magnetism, this creature of sensuality and ignorance and density. So as it goes in the individual world of each one of us, so it goes in the nations. Because the international capitalist communist conspiracy is the absolute force of death on the planet. It takes those who have embodied life with a capital L, or absolute good, to have the courage and the ability to challenge it. Most people have not gotten beyond relative life and relative death. People are relatively alive in the human sense, and they're already relatively dead. And that is generally true of the mass population. You see them walking down the street. Until they know Almighty God as a living presence in them and with them, and the Christ as their own real self, they do not embody life in the absolute sense of that God. They do not embody, therefore, the power of that life and its ability to be and to defend itself. And therefore, not having the position of life in the ultimate sense of being God, they do not even recognize the difference between absolute evil and the subtle gradations of relative good and evil. They have no enemy because they have not become God. So they do not see anti-God as a force that must be overturned for the sake of these little ones. So you see how far along the path you as a teacher, working under the world teachers, you as a world teacher have to bring people before they will come to the realization of the internalization of God that is the only antidote for the forces of this international capitalist communist conspiracy. I see people, and I see them on the path of Chilaship from their inception for years and years and years. But I still see people who come to that place where absolute evil creates the necessity of embodying absolute life, and then the challenge and the responsibility to take that stand wherever that stand has to be taken. That moment is not desired by all who espouse the Master's teachings. That moment of realizing that all of the joy of the violet flame and the path of the teaching is leading you to the full role of Christhood and Godhood. That moment is resisted by many light bearers on the planet who would rather enjoy the stream of light and life, play in it, have good times, have wonderful families, businesses, have their little cottage and their white picket fence with climbing roses, fulfilling the dreams, realized or not, over many centuries. I see people turning away who don't want to see, who would like to enjoy a little more Maya and illusion for a while, who would like the so-called bliss of that illusion to neutralize them for a while from the horrendous actions that are being taken against all mankind by the fallen angels in our midst. It is a great sorrow. I have nourished and nurtured and led people for many, many years who, when it comes to this place and this confrontation, step to the side. They will not keep on that straight and forward path and let the path take them where it leads them to that confrontation. I know that many of you here, if not all of you here today, would rather enter that confrontation than enjoy another morsel of cake or candy or anything else that life affords, that you are totally ready for it. I know you are ready as I am. There is nothing that could be so sweet on earth that I would desire to enjoy while knowing that my black brothers and my white brothers in South Africa are being massacred and burned and decimated by those fallen angels who have gotten away with their murder and their lies for too long. I know one thing, and that is when keepers of the flame worldwide determine to challenge a nest of serpents in their conspiracy in a certain area, tremendous changes occur. I have told you that during our trial, the greatest desecration to me was the embroilment of our energy and our entanglement in defending ourselves in the courts of this world, which are truly the courts of hell, and therefore postponing our taking up our swords against this international conspiracy that is at our back door in Nicaragua and is also all across our country. So here we are today, and we are free to defend ourselves and the peoples of many nations. I could have selected the many problems we have in the United States today, but I think that America is healthy and strong enough with the light bearers we have to throw off many problems. But I am gravely concerned when I see all of the forces of this ICCC converging like vultures on one nation, and therefore we must take our stand and give this our life. It is such a small world. It is small when you think about a nuclear warhead arriving in the United States in a matter of minutes. It's small when you go stumping and see the light bearers in every nation smiling. You can't tell what nationality they are. You only know they came from the God Star. They're pilgrims. They need awakening, quickening, marshaling of forces, galvanizing. They need to be reminded not to go back into their petty ways of self-indulgence. They need to be reminded of the vision. And when they see that vision, there's nothing stopping them. It's a joyous moment, but it's a very, very serious one. So let us get on with these facts. McIlvaney goes on to show how the current situation in South Africa matches the revolutionary agenda. A growing number of townships throughout South Africa, there are over 800, are becoming ungovernable as conventional methods of administration and control collapse under the weight of an escalating people's revolt. In many parts of the country, black city councilors and mayors are being forced to flee their posts. In recent weeks, 5 councilors have been murdered. 109 attacked and 147 have resigned as their homes and businesses were burned and they were faced with financial ruin. These are black moderates. Every time the Soviets take over in every nation, they kill the moderates. They kill those who are keepers of the flame and who endure to the end and will bring a nation to that correct God consciousness of equality and freedom for all. In the Transvaal alone, 33 mayors and councillors have been forced to resign. Mr. Kinekini of the Kwa Nobuli Council in Uitenhage refused to follow his colleagues and quit. He was hacked and burnt to death with 5 other members of his family as crazed mobs led by the ANC, the United Democratic Front, comrades, hacked their victims with axes, picks, and spades, poured gasoline on them and set them on fire, and then ate pieces of their bodies. The African National Congress is an outlawed anti-apartheid organization. The UDF, the United Democratic Front, is an offshoot of it. The police have withdrawn their resident black policemen from many of the townships after over 600 black policemen's homes have been firebombed and destroyed, and dozens of them and their families brutally murdered. It should be noted that the South African police are made of 16,000 white and 18,000 black policemen. Necklacing is consistently used as a means of executing moderate black policemen, counselors, businessmen, sellouts, etc. This slow, agonizing death is often accompanied by stoning and sometimes eating of the burnt flesh even before the victim has died. The intimidation pact of such atrocities on frightened black moderates is tremendous, especially since many black Africans believe in reincarnation, and they believe that if their body is burnt, they will return in a later life as an animal or an insect. The revolutionaries have established their own rule in many black townships as an alternate authority to the disbanded local government or the central government. The revolutionaries' rule is demonstrated and strengthened by their ability to enforce their work and consumer boycotts through violence and intimidation, and their ability to mobilize huge crowds for funerals, rallies, and attacks on the police. Their failure to participate can result in a black's brutal murder. They are being forced by the Marxists and the murderers themselves to participate in these demonstrations. Communist street committees run by comrades, revolutionary people's courts presided over by magistrates appointed by the revolutionaries are becoming commonplace. No one in these townships may refuse to attend these courts, refuse to abide by their ruling, or complain to the police. Sellouts or other collaborators found guilty by these people's courts are swiftly given the necklace treatment or otherwise brutally murdered. Over 1,237 blacks have died in the townships over the past 18 months, 107 in February alone, 2/3 of them brutally murdered by the revolutionaries, and about 1/3 of them revolutionaries killed by the police. There are 11 townships now considered no-go areas by the white authorities and totally under the control and authority of the ANC and the UDF revolutionaries, and dozens more are under their partial control. If these alternative governments continue to grow like a cancer, they will usurp the authority of the central government to such an extent that it will eventually fall. Did you know that there is a tremendous influx of wealthy South Africans to the United States, to Los Angeles, of course assisted by our immigration service, who is very happy to see their money and their wealth come into the United States for investment and business purposes. These individuals, of course, see the handwriting on the wall, they see the hopelessness of it. They do not have the sword of the living spirit with which to defend themselves, so they are taking what to them is the most logical and sane course: to get out of South Africa before it's too late. America is becoming a haven and always has been, but more so today, of people escaping oncoming Soviet regimes. The Soviet flag first appeared at a South African UDF funeral rally in July '85. Today, the Soviet flag, the flag of the South African Communist Party, and the flag of the African National Congress are a regular feature at mass funeral rallies held by the UDF and ANC in townships all over South Africa. The fact that the communists now brazenly and openly parade the Soviet and South African Communist Party flags in black townships all across South Africa in total defiance of their government is a sign of momentum of the revolution and their belief in the impotence of the government. The government is not impotent, but their belief in it makes them brazen, gives them courage. And so it becomes a human wave, which by its own belief empowers itself. They no longer have to hide the true nature of the revolution. The revolutionaries appear to have rendered the South African legal system ineffective as a weapon against them. This can be seen by the fact that although the first town councilors were killed by mob violence more than 18 months ago, no one has yet been convicted for murder in connection with their deaths. Justice is not being done and is being seen as not having been done, as the revolutionaries brag that the law cannot touch them. Let's not call them revolutionaries, let's call them demons incarnate. And let us understand that the law can touch them and bind them and render them impotent if we make the call. If we do not make the call, it will not come to pass. How many of you have had the experience in your life, as I have had, to see the consequences of an occasion when you failed to make a call and a calamity happened? How many have ever observed that and known it to be true? Raise your hands high. I want you to turn around and see this. Leave your hands up, because what I want people to see is how the Lord is teaching us. The Lord is teaching us by showing us that the call does work, and that our neglect to make this call does have far-reaching consequences. That is why the altar is home to me, because I know absolutely that that call compels an answer, and that Archangel Michael will never, never, never fail. I was speaking with a keeper of the flame who was concerned about a situation of a force of evil, and I heard myself guaranteeing to her that Archangel Michael would take care of it if she would make the call. And I thought about that for the next 12 hours, and I was thinking to myself, here you are being the guarantor on earth for Archangel Michael. And I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I said to myself, it's absolutely true. I can guarantee that if you make the call, Archangel Michael will take care of it. There is no question about it at all. I can make that guarantee, and so can you. You must know the science of the call. You must be willing to make it into the day and into the night, and to continue it until that battle and force is won, because he needs your energy in addition to your call. You can guarantee it, and any fear or doubt or indecision or neglect on your part is a sign that the Maya and the illusion of the international capitalist communist conspiracy that has turned many of the churches of America into red communist bastions is affecting you. When you cease to have the absolute conviction of Archangel Michael's intercession in your behalf and trust him that he is delivering you in his own way that you may not presently understand, you have lost your centeredness in your I am presence. And you better get back to your decrees and see to it that you absolutely know in your heart that nothing can come nigh you or your house, because Archangel Michael is there and because you are faithful to his decrees. I think we should give him a round of applause for saving our church. Archangel Michael! Hail, Archangel Michael! Hail, Archangel Michael! Thank you. Won't you be seated? Due to pressure from the South African and world media and liberals in the South African government, The government has dropped charges against most of the UDF ANC leaders, such as Dr. Alan Bosak, Dr. Alan Bisak, and Winnie Mandela in recent months. Another feature of the revolution, in addition to the people power being promised by the revolutionaries, is pupil power. Hundreds of thousands of children ages 10 to 18 in the townships, many of them illegitimate with no fathers, who have rebelled against the authority of their parents and who are being mobilized and used as the shock troops and cannon fodder of the revolution. Some of the most horrific murders are committed by 13 and 14-year-old youths. Over the decades since the Soweto riots in 1976, thousands of these black youths have been taken to Cuba, Libya, Russia, and other East Bloc countries, trained in terrorism, and have now been infiltrated back into the black South African townships to help lead the revolution. Some of you will remember a very wonderful staff member and member of our board, Florence Bernie Vischer Miller, who passed on suddenly a number of years ago and made her ascension. She grew up in South Africa, of Dutch parents who were in the field of representing Holland in South Africa. She considered herself South African, had a South African accent, and told us of the great beauty of the country. I feel we should remember that she, who is now called the Ascended Lady Master Christine, is truly a part of the legions of the Divine Mother who are leading the light bearers in the rescue of this nation. I do feel her joy in this moment that we are attentive to this problem. The leaders of the outlawed African National Congress, despite their benign treatment in the Western press, clearly have Marxist leanings and Soviet ties. Even the left-wing magazine The Nation proclaimed unabashedly in May that the ANC is allied with South Africa's small Communist Party and does receive most of its weapons from the Soviet Union. Winnie Mandela was quoted in the Soviet daily Pravda as saying, "The Soviet Union is the torchbearer for all our hopes and aspirations. The land of the Soviets is the genuine friend and ally of all peoples fighting against the dark forces of world reaction." Why isn't that in the Los Angeles Times?